History is filled with stories of great cities brought down by invading armies, by fire, or by plague. But only once, in the summer of 1858, was the greatest city on earth defeated by its own smell. London, capital of empire, workshop of the world, the beating heart of global commerce, was about to learn that pride comes before a fall, and that fall would be accompanied by a stench so overwhelming it would drive Parliament itself into panicked flight. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you the proper picture first. By 1858, London had swollen to magnificent, monstrous proportions. 2.5 million souls crammed into its ancient streets. More people than had ever before gathered in a single city in human history. From the docks of the East End to the mansions of Mayfair, from the counting houses of the city to the slums of Southwark, this was civilization's crowning achievement. The British Empire stretched across the globe, painting the map pink from Canada to India, and every thread of that vast web led back here, to this city perched on the banks of the Thames. Yet beneath all that imperial grandeur lurked a dark secret, a festering, rotting secret that London had been pouring into its river for centuries. And in the sweltering heat of that particular summer, the river decided it was time to present the bill. The villain of our story wasn't a person. It wasn't even cholera, though that invisible killer had already claimed tens of thousands of London souls. No, the true antagonist was something far more elemental, far more democratic in its reach. It was a smell so powerful, so overwhelming, so utterly inescapable that it would accomplish what no foreign army or domestic uprising ever could. It would bring the mighty British Empire to a complete standstill. They called it the Great Stink, though that rather understates the Gothic horror of what actually transpired. This wasn't merely an unpleasant odour. This was an atmospheric presence, a malevolent force that seeped through closed windows, crawled under doors, and pursued its victims from the poorest hovel to the Palace of Westminster itself. It respected no boundaries of class or station. When the wind shifted, millionaires retched alongside paupers. Our story is one of hubris and humiliation, of warnings ignored until catastrophe could no longer be denied. It's the tale of a brilliant scientist whose prophecy fell on deaf ears, of politicians who spent decades debating the problem while London literally rotted around them, and of the quiet, methodical engineer who would wage a secret war in the darkness beneath the city streets to save it from itself. For those of you drawn to the strange and forgotten crises of history, to the moments when progress collided with its own consequences, then you found the right place. Consider subscribing to hear more stories of humanity's darkest hours and unlikely triumphs. But for now, settle back as we return to that unseasonably warm spring of 1858, when London basked in the sunshine of its own greatness, blissfully unaware that its greatest shame was already beginning to rise from the water. 3 years before the crisis that would nearly destroy London, a man of impeccable reputation took a simple boat ride that should have changed everything. The man was Michael Faraday, and if you don't know the name, you should. This was the scientist who'd unlock the secrets of electricity and magnetism, whose discoveries would power the modern world. When Faraday spoke, the educated classes of Victorian England listened. Usually, on that July day in 1855, Faraday boarded a steamboat for what should have been a pleasant journey between London and Hungerford bridges. What he found instead was a floating laboratory, demonstrating the depths of urban degradation. Being a scientist, he didn't simply recoil in horror, he investigated. The Thames, that ancient artery of English commerce and culture, had been transformed into something Faraday could barely recognise as water. He described it, with scientific precision, as an opaque pale brown fluid. But Faraday wasn't content with mere observation. he devised an impromptu experiment that would become legendary in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Taking white cards from his pocket, he tore them into pieces and dropped them into the river at various points along his journey. The results were damning. Before the cards had sunk even an inch below the surface, they vanished completely, swallowed by the impenetrable murk. Even with the sun blazing overhead, the water was so thick with filth that it had become utterly opaque. Near the bridges, Faraday observed what he called feculence, a delicate Victorian term for human waste, rolling up in clouds so dense they were visible at the surface, like some hellish parody of storm clouds. The smell was beyond description, though Faraday tried, noting in his letter that it was identical to what rose from the gully holes in the streets, those grated openings to the sewer system that punctuated London's pavements. The entire river, he declared, had become for the time a real sewer. Horrified by what he'd witnessed, Faraday did what any responsible citizen of his era would do. He wrote a letter to the Times, but this wasn't merely a complaint. It was a warning, delivered with the gravity of an Old Testament prophet. London, he wrote, could not expect to pour its filth into the Thames indefinitely without consequence. The city was playing a dangerous game with its own waste, and he feared, no, he knew, that retribution would come. Nor ought we to be surprised, he concluded with chilling prescience, if, ere many years are over, a hot season give us sad proof of the folly of our carelessness. The Times published the letter. Punch magazine even ran a famous cartoon showing Faraday presenting his white card to a grotesque Father Thames, a skeletal figure rising from the polluted waters. Everyone had a good laugh, and then they did absolutely nothing. Here's where our story takes its first darkly ironic turn. The crisis Faraday predicted wasn't simply the result of London's growth or some failure of urban planning. It was in fact the direct consequence of what the authorities considered a public health triumph. You see, for centuries, London had dealt with human waste through a simple, unpleasant system. Every house had its cesspit, a brick-lined hole in the ground where waste accumulated until the night soil men came to empty it, carting the contents away to be sold as fertilizer to the farms that fed the city. It wasn't pretty, but it was a closed loop, and it kept the waste out of the water supply. But progress, as it so often does, arrived with unintended consequences. The water closet, that marvel of modern sanitation we now call the flush toilet, had been proudly displayed at the Great Exhibition of 1851. The public had been enchanted. Here was civilization. Here was the future. No more chamber pots, no more trips to the privy. Just pull a chain and watch your problems disappear. Except they didn't disappear. They just became someone else's problem. Specifically, the problem of the River Thames. The old cesspits couldn't handle the volume of water from these new flush toilets. They overflowed, they leaked, and so, in 1848, in what must have seemed like a sensible decision at the time, the authorities had issued a fateful order: connect the cesspits to the sewers. The problem was that London's sewers hadn't been designed for human waste. They were storm drains, built to carry rainwater away from the streets. Every one of them led, with the inevitability of gravity, straight to the Thames. The city had transformed its river into a vast open-air toilet, and every flush of every water closet in London was adding to the accumulation. By the time Faraday took his prophetic boat ride, an estimated 90 million gallons of raw sewage were pouring into the Thames every single day. This wasn't a river anymore. It was a 200-mile-long cesspit, its contents sloshing back and forth with the tides, never truly leaving, just oscillating through the heart of the empire's capital, like a hideous metronome keeping time to the city's decay. And then came 1858. The winter had been mild, the spring dry. As May turned to June, an oppressive heat settled over London like a suffocating blanket. Day after day, Temperatures soared to levels that would be uncomfortable even by today's standards. In the shade, the mercury hit 97 degrees Fahrenheit. In the sun, thermometers recorded an almost unbelievable 118 degrees. The drought had been going on for weeks. The level of the Thames dropped and dropped and dropped again, exposing vast expanses of the riverbed that normally remained mercifully submerged. These weren't beaches of sand or stone. They were accumulations of everything London had been pouring into its river for decades. Human waste, animal carcasses from the slaughterhouses, industrial chemicals, household refuse, the detritus of 2.5 million lives all mixed together in a hellish cocktail and left to ferment. And now, under the blazing June sun, this monstrous accumulation began to cook. The chemistry of decay was working overtime, creating a symphony of stench that defied classification. It was a complex and ever-changing perfume of putrefaction that evolved hour by hour, always finding new ways to assault the senses. London had smelled bad before, of course. This was a city where horses dropped dead in the streets and might lie there for days, where slaughterhouses operated in residential neighbourhoods, where tanneries and factories poured their chemicals wherever convenience dictated. But this was different. This wasn't just another bad smell to add to the urban collection. This was all of London's sins against sanitation concentrated and reflected back at her, magnified by the heat into something that transcended mere odour and became a presence, a force, a malevolent entity that would soon hold the entire city hostage. The stage was set, the players were in position, the great stink was preparing for its grand entrance, and when it fully arrived, it would transform the greatest city on earth into one vast, open-air chamber of horrors, where every breath was a reminder of the price of progress and the cost of neglect. In the grand mansions of Belgravia, in the counting houses of the city, in the halls of Westminster itself, people were beginning to realise that Faraday's prophecy hadn't been hyperbole. It had been, if anything, an understatement. The hot season had come, and with it, the sad proof of the city's folly was about to make itself known in ways that would be impossible to ignore, impossible to escape, and very nearly impossible to survive. The villain of our story was finally taking the stage, and London was about to discover that when you spend centuries turning your river into a sewer, eventually the sewer fights back. For all its sophistication, for all its gaslight and railways and telegraphs, Victorian London lived in terror of something that didn't exist. The city's finest minds believed, with absolute conviction, in a killer that was nothing more than a phantom. They called it miasma, poisonous vapour that rose from filth and decay. And in the summer of 1858, they were convinced it was coming for them all. This wasn't some folk superstition. The medical establishment, led by sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick, proclaimed that all smell was disease. In Chadwick's world, to inhale was to play Russian roulette with your life. The logic seemed unassailable. The filthiest neighbourhoods suffered the most from disease, and the worst outbreaks coincided with the worst smells. Therefore, the smell must be the cause. This belief transformed the great stink from a mere assault on the senses into an existential threat. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was death itself, creeping through the air in invisible clouds, seeking victims with every shift of the wind, and unlike cholera's previous visits, which had largely confined themselves to the poor districts, this airborne assassin showed no respect for social boundaries. The miasma was thoroughly democratic in its reach. The newspapers fanned the flames of panic with gleeful abandon. Stories flew through the city of men struck down in the street by a single breath of the poisoned air. Every death near the Thames was blamed on the noxious effluvia that invaded riverside homes. For the citizens of London, every breath became an act of courage, or foolhardiness. The wealthy retreated behind closed doors, burning aromatics and sprinkling their rooms with perfume in a desperate attempt to create barriers against the invisible killer. The poor, who had no choice but to continue their daily lives in the poisoned air, wrapped scarves around their faces and muttered prayers. But it was in the halls of power that the panic reached its most theatrical heights, the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament, that Gothic revival masterpiece that was meant to symbolise Britain's glory, sat right on the river's edge. And in June of 1858, it found itself on the front lines of the war against the miasma. Picture, if you will, the world's most powerful legislators fleeing their own chambers like rats from a sinking ship. Members of Parliament, men who prided themselves on their dignity and decorum, could be seen racing from committee rooms with their handkerchiefs pressed desperately to their noses, their eyes streaming, and their faces contorted in disgust and fear. The courts of law at Westminster Hall were almost stunk out. Barristers in their wigs and gowns abandoned their cases mid-argument, choosing contempt of court over another moment in that poisoned atmosphere. One particularly vivid report captured the Right Honourable Benjamin Disraeli himself, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or a man who would soon be Prime Minister, beating a hasty retreat from a committee room. There he was, one of the most powerful men in the empire, clutching a mass of important papers in one hand while the other pressed a handkerchief to his nose, fleeing like a schoolboy from a stink bomb. The image was both comic and terrifying. If the miasma could root a man like Disraeli, what hope did ordinary mortals have? Members reported being utterly unable to remain in the library and committee rooms that faced the river. The smell, they said, was not merely offensive, it was physically overwhelming, causing headaches, nausea, and a general sense of impending doom that made rational thought, let alone the business of running an empire, completely impossible. In desperation, the authorities tried to fight smell with smell. The great curtains that hung in the riverside windows of Parliament were soaked in chloride of lime, that all-purpose Victorian disinfectant. It didn't work. If anything, the mixture of chloride of a lime and Thames stench created an even more nauseating cocktail, adding a sharp chemical burn to the organic rot. The government even began seriously discussing the unthinkable, abandoning London entirely. Plans were drawn up to relocate Parliament to Oxford or St Albans, anywhere that might offer refuge from the capital's toxic atmosphere. Think about that for a moment. The heart of the British Empire, the seat of power that administered a quarter of the globe, was preparing to flee from a smell. But here's where our story takes another of its darkly ironic turns. This panic, this overwhelming fear that finally motivated the government to action, was based on a completely false premise. The miasma theory was wrong. Utterly, completely, catastrophically wrong. Smell doesn't cause disease. The stench rising from the Thames was certainly unpleasant, certainly nauseating, but it wasn't killing anyone. At least, not directly. The real killer was in the water, not the air. But nobody knew that yet. The medical establishment was so wedded to the miasma theory that they ignored evidence to the contrary, including the painstaking work of a physician named John Snow, who had mapped the 1854 Soho cholera outbreak to a single contaminated water pump. So London continued to operate under a massive misapprehension. The entire city was mobilising to fight the wrong enemy, like an army firing its cannons at shadows while the real threat crept up from behind. It was Disraeli who finally put words to the crisis that would galvanise Parliament into action, rising in the House of Commons, his usually measured tones taking on an almost Gothic intensity. He described the Thames as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. The classical allusion wasn't lost on his educated audience. Styx was the river of the underworld, the boundary between the living and the dead. London's river had become a pathway to hell itself, with remarkable speed. remarkable especially for a body that could spend years debating the proper width of a railway gauge, Parliament moved to action. Disraeli introduced the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Bill, giving the Metropolitan Board of Works the power to completely rebuild London's sewer system, and crucially, the authority to borrow £3 million to do it, an almost incomprehensible sum that demonstrated the depth of their panic. The bill that had been mired in committee for years, blocked by competing interests and financial concerns, passed through Parliament in a mere 18 days, from introduction to royal assent. In parliamentary terms, that was faster than a sneeze. The panic had accomplished what years of epidemics, tens of thousands of deaths, and the pleading of public health reformers had failed to achieve. It had made the powerful personally uncomfortable. When cholera had confined itself to the slums, Parliament could afford to deliberate. When the stench invaded their own chambers, when they found themselves fleeing their own offices, when their work became impossible and their lives unbearable, then, and only then, did they act with appropriate urgency. The city's salvation would now rest in the hands of one man, Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. He had been waiting in the wings for years, plans already drawn, calculations already made, watching with the patience of a chess master as the crisis he had long predicted finally forced the city's hand. But as June turned to July and the heat showed no signs of breaking, as the Thames continued to shrink and the exposed mudflats continued to fester in the sun, even Bazalgette must have wondered if he had been handed his commission too late. The Great Stink was approaching its peak, and London was running out of time. The miasma might have been imaginary, but the panic was real, the suffering was genuine, and the city was teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. The race was on. Could Bazalgette build his underground fortress against filth before the city above ground succumbed to chaos? Could London be saved by fighting the wrong enemy for the right reasons? The answer would lie deep beneath the streets, in a network of tunnels that would become one of the wonders of the industrial age. Built to fight a phantom, but destined to save an empire. Joseph Bazalgette occupies a peculiar position. He wasn't a swashbuckling general or a charismatic politician. He didn't seek fame or court controversy. He was, in every sense of the word, an engineer, methodical, meticulous, and obsessed with getting things right. And in the summer of 1858, he became the most important man in London. Bazalgette came from Huguenot stock, those French Protestants who had fled religious persecution and brought their work ethic and attention to detail to England's shores. Born in 1819, he had learned early that perfectionism could be both blessing and curse. A nervous breakdown in his youth from overwork had taught him to channel his obsession rather than let it consume him. By 1856, when the Metropolitan Board of Works was formed, he was their natural choice for chief engineer. For years, he had been preparing for this moment like a general planning a campaign. While politicians debated and deferred, while committees formed and dissolved, while the Thames grew fouler and the death toll mounted, Bazalgette quietly drew his plans, thousands of them. He knew London's underground landscape better than most people knew their own neighbourhoods. His plan, when finally unleashed, was breathtaking in its elegant simplicity. Rather than try to rebuild London's chaotic maze of local sewers, over 13,000 miles of pipes installed piecemeal over centuries, he would leave them in place. Instead, he would build a new system underneath the existing one, a network of massive intercepting sewers that would catch the flow from the old pipes before it could reach the Thames. Picture it as a series of underground rivers, flowing west to east beneath London's streets. These weren't mere pipes. They were tunnels large enough for men to walk through upright, brick-lined caverns that would channel millions of gallons of waste away from the city's heart. Using the natural slope of the Thames Valley, most of the sewage would flow by gravity alone to new outfall points far downstream, at Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south, where the tides would carry it out to sea. But Bazalgette understood that London's topography wouldn't cooperate entirely with his gravitational scheme. His solution was characteristically ambitious. Massive pumping stations equipped with the largest steam engines in the world, mechanical hearts that would lift the sewage from the depths and send it on its way. The engineering challenges were staggering. The tunnels had to be strong enough to withstand the weight of the city above, watertight enough to prevent seepage, and precisely graded to maintain the perfect flow, fast enough to prevent blockages, slow enough to prevent erosion. His masterstroke was the egg-shaped design of the main sewers. While smaller pipes were circular, the great interceptors were ovoid, narrow at the bottom, wide at the top. This wasn't aesthetic whimsy, it was engineering genius. During dry periods when flow was reduced, the narrow bottom concentrated the stream, increasing its velocity and scouring power. The sewers would essentially clean themselves, but it's the story of the pipes that truly reveals Bazalgette's character. After calculating the necessary diameter for the interceptor sewers, calculations based on the highest population density estimates and the most generous water usage projections, he made a decision that would echo through history. He looked at his numbers, those carefully computed figures that represented the absolute maximum capacity London could conceivably need. And then he did something remarkable. He doubled them. "We're only going to do this once," he reportedly said, "and there's always the unforeseen." With a stroke of his pen, he increased the diameter of every main sewer in his system. It was an act of humility disguised as engineering bravado, an admission that even the most careful calculations couldn't anticipate every future possibility. This wasn't just adding a safety margin. Doubling the diameter of a pipe quadruples its capacity. Bazalgette was building for a London that didn't yet exist, a city that would grow beyond anything his contemporaries could imagine. He couldn't foresee the invention of the garbage disposal or the automatic washing machine, couldn't predict that London's population would triple again, couldn't know about the skyscrapers that would one day pack thousands into spaces that held hundreds. But he knew that the future would surprise them all, and he planned accordingly. The decision would cost a fortune in extra materials and labour, but the panic of the Great Stink had given Bazalgette something precious. Carte blanche. The same parliament that had haggled over every penny now wanted results, not economy. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bazalgette's character was his attention to the human element. The construction of his system would require an army of workers, thousands of men labouring in dangerous conditions, digging through London's unstable soil, working by candlelight in confined spaces where one cave-in could mean disaster. In an era when industrial casualties were grimly accepted as the price of progress, Bazalgette achieved something extraordinary. Over the entire course of the sewer construction, only 10 deaths were officially recorded. This wasn't luck. It was the result of meticulous planning and genuine concern for worker safety. Bazalgette insisted on proper shoring of excavations, adequate ventilation in the tunnels, and systematic safety procedures. He regularly inspected the works himself, not just checking the quality of construction, but ensuring the well-being of his workers. His hands-on approach extended to every aspect of the project. He personally reviewed and approved every single connection made to his main system. His signature appeared on document after document, a testament to his direct oversight of even the smallest details. He wasn't just building a sewer system, he was crafting a masterpiece. And like any artist, he obsessed over every brush stroke. As July 1858 wore on, and the Great Stink reached its nauseating peak, Bazalgette finalised his plans. Parliament had given him the money and the authority. Now he needed to transform paper into brick, calculations into construction. The greatest engineering project of the age was about to begin, a race against time and tide to save London from itself. Somewhere in the city, members of Parliament were still fleeing their chambers, still pressing perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, still believing they were running from the miasma. They didn't realise that their real salvation would come not from cleaner air but from cleaner water, not from fighting the smell but from preventing the contamination that was the true killer. Bazalgette knew better than to correct them. Let them believe what they wanted, as long as they let him build. The architect of the underworld had drawn his plans. Now it was time to bring his dark kingdom to life, one brick at a time, one tunnel at a length, one calculated gradient at a perfect slope. London's salvation lay not in the heights of imperial glory, but in the depths of engineering precision. And Joseph Bazalgette, the quiet man with the careful hands and the doubled pipes, would be the one to deliver it. If Bazalgette was the general in London's war against filth, then the navvies were his army. The term was short for navigators, a name inherited from the men who had carved Britain's canal system out of raw earth a generation before. Now their sons and grandsons would perform an even greater feat of excavation, not across the countryside but beneath the very streets of the world's greatest city. Picture them, thousands of men, many Irish, converging on London with nothing but strong backs and stronger constitutions. They lived in rough camps near the construction sites and faced the prejudice of respectable society, who viewed them as dangerous but necessary. If they drank hard and lived rough, it was perhaps because they faced death every day in the tunnels, and tomorrow was never guaranteed. The work itself defied modern comprehension. Every foot of Bazalgette's system had to be excavated by hand. Picks and shovels against London clay, gravel, and waterlogged soil. The main interceptor sewers were massive, some large enough to drive a carriage through. Creating these underground caverns required a carefully choreographed dance of destruction and construction. First came the excavation, with men working by candlelight in the depths, filling bucket after bucket with spoil that had to be hauled to the surface. Behind them came the bricklayers, working with Bazalgette's precious Portland cement to line the tunnels. 318 million bricks would be laid before the project was complete, each one placed by hand, each one part of a structure intended to last centuries. Consider the working conditions. In summer, the tunnels were stifling, airless caves. In winter, they were frigid, dripping dungeons. Always there was the smell. Not just the sewage they were building to contain, but the reek of centuries-old deposits they disturbed. The navvies developed their own techniques for survival, learning to read the earth and recognise the warning signs of collapse. They worked in teams that grew as close as soldiers in combat, each man's life depending on his mate's vigilance. The accident rate was remarkably low, just 10 official fatalities over the entire project, but official is a flexible term, and minor injuries were so common as to hardly merit mention. Crushed fingers, wrenched backs, and tunnel sickness were daily occurrences. The navvies treated these ailments with their own rough medicine, and the universal remedy of getting back to work as soon as possible. But the true monuments to this underground campaign were rising above ground at the pumping stations, and what monuments they were, in an act of supreme Victorian confidence, or perhaps supreme irony. These temples to sewage were being built with all the grandeur of cathedrals. At Crossness, the Byzantine-inspired engine house rose from the Erith marshes like something from a fever dream. Imagine walking into what you knew to be a sewage pumping station and finding yourself in a palace of ironwork. The great beam engines, each named after members of the royal family: Victoria, Albert, Prince Consort, Alexandra, stood like mechanical giants in a setting that belonged in a palace. Every surface that could be decorated was decorated. The cast iron columns bloomed with intricate patterns. The colour scheme, reds, greens, golds, would have been at home in a music hall. Abbey Mills, the northern counterpart, took the architectural madness even further. built in a style that could only be called Byzantine Moorish Gothic fantasy. It looked like a Russian Orthodox church crossed with a Venetian palace. Twin chimneys, originally designed to look like Ottoman minarets, reached toward the sky. It was immediately dubbed the Cathedral of Sewage, and the name was not entirely mocking. Inside these fantastic structures, the beam engines were the largest in the world, their massive pistons capable of lifting millions of gallons of sewage 40 feet into the air. When operational, they were poetry in motion. The great beams rocking back and forth with mechanical precision, the flywheels spinning in perfect balance, the pumps drawing London's waste up from the depths and sending it on its journey to the sea. As the tunnels spread beneath London like a vast spiderweb, and the pumping stations rose like industrial cathedrals, the city above began to breathe a little easier. The great stink of 1858 had passed with the autumn rains, but everyone knew it would return with the next hot summer unless Bazalgette's system was complete. The race was on, driven by the memory of that terrible summer and the fear of its return, but down in the tunnels, in the engine rooms, in the slowly spreading network of brick-lined passages, a different transformation was taking place. The navvies, the engineers, the bricklayers, and the mechanics weren't just building a sewer system. They were creating a hidden city beneath the city, a dark mirror to the London above. They were winning the war in the dark, one shovel of earth at a time, one perfectly laid brick at a row, one revolution of the great engines at a beat, and when they were done, London would have something unprecedented, a circulatory system worthy of the world's greatest city, even if that system carried not blood but something considerably less noble. The transformation of London's waste from crisis to engineering triumph was nearly complete. All that remained was to finish the connections, test the system, and throw the switches that would bring Bazalgette's underground kingdom to life. When that day came, the Thames would begin its slow journey back from open sewer to something approaching a river again. For now, in the dying years of the 1850s, in the tunnels beneath London, victory was measured in feet of tunnel completed, in successful tests of the pumping engines, in the slowly spreading network that would soon make the Great Stink nothing more than a bad memory. The war in the dark was being won, one brick at a time. By 1865, the last bricks were being laid in Bazalgette's underground empire. The great pumps at Crossness and Abbey Mills had roared to life, their mechanical hearts beating in steady rhythm. The Prince of Wales himself had done the honours at Crossness, turning the ceremonial wheel that set the massive engines in motion. It was a moment of triumph that should have been accompanied by fanfare and angels. Instead, it was marked by the distinctly unheroic sound of sewage beginning its journey to the Thames estuary. London collectively exhaled. The Thames, that ancient river that had become the city's shame, began its slow transformation back to something resembling water. The stench that had driven Parliament to panic retreated. The Great Stink had been defeated. Or so everyone thought. The victory celebrations were based on a fundamental misunderstanding that would have been comic if it weren't so tragic. London had spent over £3 million, torn up miles of streets, and employed thousands of workers for the better part of a decade to fight the wrong enemy. The entire magnificent system had been built to combat bad smells. The miasma theory, that phantom killer that had terrorized the city, had driven the creation of one of the greatest engineering works of the age. But here's where our story takes its final, ironic turn. The system built to fight a phantom had accidentally vanquished a real monster. The truth revealed itself in 1866, when cholera struck again, but this time confined to a single East End district not yet connected to Bazalgette's sewers. Over 5,000 people died, but their deaths provided crucial evidence. Where Bazalgette's sewers operated, cholera was absent. Where the old system persisted, death followed. It wasn't the air that killed, It was the water. This revelation came too late for Dr. John Snow, who had died in June 1858 at the very height of the Great Stink, believing himself a failure. Every mile of sewer tunnel, every gallon pumped eastward, every connection that separated sewage from drinking water was a monument to the truth he had tried so desperately to convey. The irony was perfect. London had built the right solution for the wrong reason. The city had mobilized its resources, revolutionized its infrastructure, and saved countless lives, all while aiming at the wrong target. But Bazalgette's true genius revealed itself not in what his system did in 1865, but in what it continued to do for the next century and a half. Remember those doubled pipes? That decision meant that as London grew from 2.5 million souls to over 8 million, as flush toilets went from luxury to universal necessity, as washing machines and dishwashers added their burden to the flow, the Victorian sewers simply handled it. A system designed in the age of horses and gaslight, built by men with picks and shovels, continued to serve a city of electricity and automobiles, of skyscrapers and subway systems. Bazalgette had built not just for his London, but for a London he could never have imagined. Walk along the Thames embankment today and try to imagine the apocalyptic stench that once rose from these waters. You can't. The crisis that brought an empire to its knees has been so thoroughly conquered that it's passed from memory into history, from history into legend. Modern Londoners live their lives above Bazalgette's hidden kingdom, without a thought for what flows beneath their feet. They cross the Thames without holding their breath, drink water from taps without fear, flush toilets with the casual confidence of those who've never known the alternative. The system that saved them works in darkness and silence, as invisible as the disease it prevents, as forgotten as the crisis that created it. And in that forgetting lies both the tragedy and triumph of our tale. Tragedy, because the heroes who saved London, from Bazalgette with his careful plans to the nameless navvies who died in the tunnels, deserve better than obscurity. Triumph, because their work was so successful that the horrors they prevented became literally unimaginable to those who came after. As you drift off to sleep tonight, spare a thought for the hidden city that lies beneath every great metropolis. Think of the engineers who plan for futures they'll never see, the workers who labour in darkness so others can live in light, the systems that function so perfectly they become invisible. Think of Joseph Bazalgette, who saved a city by fighting the wrong enemy and winning anyway. Think of Dr. John Snow, vindicated too late to know it. Think of the Thames, flowing cleaner now than it has in centuries, its resurrection a testament to what humanity can achieve when finally forced to confront the consequences of its own success. The Great Stink was defeated, but its legacy flows on, through tunnels and pipes, through pumping stations and treatment works, through the hidden infrastructure that makes civilization possible. It's a legacy written in Portland cement and Victorian brick, in cast iron and careful calculation, in the space between what we think we're fighting and what we're actually conquering. Rest now, secure in the knowledge that beneath your feet, in the darkness you'll never see, Bazalgette's empire continues its work. The war against filth is never truly won, only managed, channeled, directed safely away. But managed it is, with a Victorian thoroughness that puts our modern efforts to shame. The next time you turn a tap or flush without fear, remember the summer London held its breath, and the engineer who finally let it breathe again. In the end, that's what infrastructure is. The art of making the unbearable bearable, the unlivable livable, the impossible possible. It's not glamorous, it's not celebrated, but it's the thin line between civilization and chaos, between the city and the sewer, between breathing free and holding our breath in terror. The Great Stink is gone, but its lesson remains. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones we build for the wrong reasons, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who plan for futures they can't imagine. In the darkness beneath London, Bazalgette's legacy flows on, a monument more lasting than marble, more valuable than gold, a gift of forgetfulness to a city that once knew too well the price of remembering. Sleep well and breathe easy. The war in the dark was won long ago, and its victors stand eternal watch in the depths, ensuring that the summer of 1858 remains what it should be. A story, a warning, a memory of the time when London held its breath and an engineer taught it how to breathe again.